Business requires people to trust, otherwise it doesn't work. But trust is undermined where treason predominates, treason or fraud. And quite frankly, these have been dropping since the 17th century. Very few upward ticks. Essentially, it drops in English literature consistently until the point that now we could consider treason or fraud as bad sins as gluttony. Now that is not a good infrastructure for business. So we have to take that into account. Because if those leaders are going to behave that way, you cannot trust them to drive you through the Aqueronte. So where were we when all this started? Year 1500, the US was still not the US. But who was really the source of world GDP? Europe, to a large extent, but India to a larger extent, and China even to a larger one. So that's not surprising. That was where the goodies were coming from. And that was why the Christian kings decided to cut short the success of that trade route coming all the way from China and India into Europe. This is why we start with the 1500s. And as you move towards your right, you will see that the US takes over in terms of the share of the GDP, a large chunk, but Europe is still there, until the 1950s. But the great losers during that period, 1500 until the 20th century, was the East, China and India. And this is why we are surprised now, because China is so much more powerful. But really it's like a pendulum going back. And the real interesting thing that we have to deal with is this culture shock. Not only to realize that China is large, that India is also very important, and that we are dwindling. Because what we have to realize is that culture changes. Yes, it does, but it does very slowly. So coming back to Brazil, Brazil is the heir of three cultures. From Portugal, from Africa and the natives. But from Portugal, Brazil inherited essentially two cultures, the aristocratic one and the merchant one. From Africa, the tribal race and the polytheism and Ubuntu, this one is very oriented towards collaboration. But in terms of the sources of commerce and trade, it's very interesting because Brazil inherited from the Portuguese the attitude that the solutions must be win-win, while Spain continued being aristocratic and continued with an ethical behavior of winner takes all. Now, how do we apprehend a culture if we need to understand it? We can go about asking questions, yes, and comparing their replies, yes, but we can also read their literature and see what makes them tick, because when the writer has an audience, the audience actually reflects what the writer is telling you, what is important, what is not. And for example, Melville's Moby Dick is a fantastic story, can be read by adolescents and by adults, but essentially it's a story of perseverance, no matter what, even about obsession. Really that type of literature is a synonym for the craziness, the absurd, the bizarre, the preposterous, the unreal and the wild. And there are many examples of this in American literature. And in Latin American literature you have the gauchos, the cowboys from Argentina and Uruguay and southern Brazil. There's a lot of things that are different there, but these were not tradesmen. These were winner-takes-all people because they were the heirs of the Spanish, not the Portuguese. And if you go to Mexico, it's a completely different world. And one of the most beautiful novels there to understand Mexico is Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo. Beautiful, short, but very enticing. I recommend you read it if you haven't. And that was the high literature, the Moby Dick, Martín Fierro, Dos Segundos Sombra, Juan Rulfo. But the comics are there. They are read by the vast majority of the population, so you have to read those as well if you want to understand the people. And for example, The Coyote and the Roadrunner, it's an American cartoon, but it's read differently in Latin America. Actually, this is a piece of mine written for Harvard Business Review, because what happens is that the perception of the coyote is that the coyote is courageous, whereas the roadrunner seeks fairness and justice. Depends who reads it, of course, because if Latin Americans read it, the top part of those bars there see the people that show allegiance to the roadrunner. And as you see, it increases as long as you move to the right to Argentina, Brazil, and the whole of Iberia. It's very interesting. In the countries that were very disordered by, for example, drug cartels, the people press for courage and order, and therefore for the coyote. But in the other countries, people are fancy-free and footloose, and they root for the roadrunner. And the interesting thing is that the people that root for the roadrunner would not have a coyote for a leader, and Americans are fundamentally coyotes. That is why that story was written, for the audience to side with the coyote. The coyote is their hero. And when American manufacturers open their shops in Latin America, they choose people like themselves to run those factories, people who tend to be coyote-like, and they are hated by the roadrunners. So that is the first mistake, and this is why I tell you, understanding culture is very, very important. But not to worry if you are a coyote, because mostly allegiance to the coyote drops with age. So it is as if we were all born coyotes but die roadrunners. But the most important aspect of this lecture of today is that Latin Americans are very, very untrusting, and Brazilians and Colombians are about the worst. If you take the Netherlands, Países Baixos there as the epitome of trust in other people, answering the question, can you generally trust people? The Dutch are very trusting. The Germans not as much. The Americans a little bit less. The Spaniards a little bit less. But the most untrusting of them all are the Mexicans, the Brazilians, and the Colombians. So it's pretty hard to do business there unless you have friends, because clans matter. And we'll move into this in the next section. Thank you very, very much for being with me. Bye-bye for now.